In Washington, on a cold, colorless October dawn, the streets were slick with the remnants of midnight rain, the gutters alive with the soft hiss of water, the city stirring slowly under heavy, low clouds. Outside the Supreme Court, the marble steps were washed clean, reflecting the pale sky. The first rays of hesitant sunlight caught on the edges of columns that had seen centuries pass in quiet judgment. Inside, the building was a fortress of solemn whispers and echoes, the halls lined with portraits of men who once spoke law into the air and let it settle like dust upon the shoulders of the nation. On this morning, it was supposed to be another day, another docket, another session, another round of carefully measured words passed across the bench like coins between merchants. But what they didn't know was that Anita Hill was coming, not as a witness, not as a symbol, but as a storm wrapped in a gray coat, her hair pinned back, her eyes clear and unblinking. She walked up those steps alone, the click of her shoes sharp against the wet marble, her small suitcase rolling quietly behind her, its wheels leaving faint tracks in the thin film of water. Inside that suitcase was a folder. Inside that folder was the truth. She had arrived in D.C. on a red-eye flight, the plane cutting through the clouds as she looked out the window. The city below, a scatter of distant lights, like a map of every decision, every compromise, every moment she had lived to arrive here. Her fingers tapped softly against the armrest as she thought of the documents she carried, each page a memory, each signature a reminder of moments she had tried to forget, moments that now needed to be remembered. It wasn't anger that brought her here. It wasn't revenge. It was the simple, heavy weight of truth. For months, whispers had circled the marble halls, quiet conversations over coffee, brief glances in elevators, the hush that fell when his name was spoken, Clarence Thomas. He was a fortress in a black robe, a man who wore silence like armor, who let his eyes speak while his mouth remained closed, a man who had learned that power could be worn like a second skin, that the world would bow if you simply did not flinch. He had dismissed the rumors, the stories, the memories. He had smirked, leaned back in his chair, let the moment pass, let the silence swallow the words before they could become real. But Anita remembered. She remembered the calls. She remembered the laughter that never quite reached the eyes. She remembered the quiet, the cold, the darkness of rooms where words were spoken that could not be unsaid. And while Clarence Thomas had moved on, had built walls of authority around himself, Anita had been watching. She had been collecting. She had been waiting. For the day when the lights would be bright enough. For the moment when the silence would be loud enough. For the time when the truth would weigh more than fear. And today was that day. The Supreme Court's security barely glanced at her as she entered, her ID checked, her bag scanned, the polite nod of men who did not know that they were letting a storm walk through the doors. The clerks were busy, flipping through papers, whispering schedules, eyes down as they moved between rooms. Anita found a seat in the hallway, her back straight, her hands folded over the folder in her lap, her eyes scanning the marble floor, the high ceilings, the columns that rose like ancient sentinels watching over the room. She wasn't nervous. She had learned to live in rooms where her presence was questioned, where her words were doubted, where her silence was safer than the truth. But she was done with silence. Clarence Thomas entered the building an hour later, his robe slung over his arm, a leather binder tucked under the other, his eyes scanning the hallway, never resting, never seeing her. There was a smirk on his lips, the same smirk he wore when cameras flashed, when questions were asked, when decisions were made that would ripple out into the world beyond these walls. He didn't see the folder. He didn't see the way her jaw tightened. He didn't see the way her eyes followed him, calm, unblinking, steady. Inside, the room was prepared. The microphones were tested, the chairs arranged, the cameras positioned, the lights adjusted until they were just right, until they cast shadows that would define the day. The gavel would fall soon, the world would watch, and they went live. "Ms. Hill, you may proceed." The voice was calm, professional, the chairman leaning forward slightly, hands folded, eyes neutral. Anita stood, the sound of the chair scraping against the floor sharp, final. She placed the folder on the table, opening it slowly, deliberately, the gold seal catching the light, the weight of the pages heavy in her hands. Clarence Thomas shifted, his fingers tapping once against the leather binder before he stilled them. His eyes met hers. She did not look away. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee," Anita began, her voice even, the microphone catching the soft strength in her words. "I am here today because silence is not the same as peace. I am here because forgetting is not the same as healing." She opened the folder, pulling out the first document, the paper whispering as it moved. On March 3rd, 1985, at 9:42 p.m., a phone call was made to my office from Mr. Thomas, a call that contained words and threats that have lived with me for years. She placed the document on the table, sliding it forward. The room was silent. Clarence's eyes narrowed, but he did not speak. She pulled out another document. On June 12, 1986, in a closed meeting, words were spoken that were not of law, not of justice, but of power, of coercion, of the expectation that silence was the price of safety. Another paper slid across the table. She pulled out a third document. On October 7, 1987, I filed a confidential memo detailing repeated instances of harassment, of threats, of words that left scars. She placed it down, letting it rest with the others, the pile growing, the truth stacking up in quiet defiance. Clarence shifted again, his jaw tightening, his fingers wrapping around the binder as if it was the only thing keeping him steady. "Ms. Hill," the chairman said softly, "these are serious allegations." Anita turned to him, her eyes calm. "They are not allegations. They are facts." And she reached into her bag one last time, pulling out a small recorder, the device simple, unassuming, holding within it the weight of nights and days, of whispers and silences, of laughter that was never kind. She placed it on the table. "This," she said, "is a recording. A recording of conversations, of moments, of truths that were hidden behind closed doors. A recording that will show the difference between the power to speak and the power to silence." Clarence Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, the smirk gone, replaced by something colder, something older, something that had seen the weight of truth before and had turned away. But this time, he could not turn away, because the world was watching. And in the silence that followed, you could almost hear the weight of the marble columns shifting, the air itself holding its breath as the fortress cracked, as power bent under the quiet, unstoppable force of truth. The air in the room felt heavier now, the soft hum of the cameras, the quiet clicks of shutters, the low murmur from reporters scribbling notes. All of it layered beneath the silence that grew as Anita Hill sat back in her chair, hands folded, eyes steady, waiting. Clarence Thomas shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under the sudden tension that rippled through him. For a man who had built a career on measured calm, on the weaponization of silence, the crack in his composure was barely visible. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, a flicker in his eyes that darted toward the recorder on the table as if it were a live wire humming with the electricity of truth. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the tall windows, each drop a reminder that the world beyond these walls was still moving, still living, still watching. Inside, it felt as if time had slowed. Each breath was deliberate. Each glance carried weight. The chairman cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Ms. Hill, you understand the gravity of what you are presenting here today?" Anita turned her head, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I understand it better than anyone in this room." Her voice did not waver, and that alone was enough to draw the attention of every camera, every pen scratching across paper, every mind trying to piece together the narrative unfolding before them. Clarence Thomas finally spoke, his voice low, carrying the authority that came with his position, with his robe, with the decades of power that clung to him like a second skin. "This is a circus," he said, the words dropping into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples that reached every corner. His eyes locked onto Anita, challenging her, daring her to break under the pressure. Anita did not break. She leaned forward slightly, her hands still folded, her posture calm, unshaken. Truth often feels like a circus to those who have lived comfortably in its absence. A flicker of something crossed Clarence's face, a shadow of anger, of fear, of something that he quickly swallowed, replacing it with the cold neutrality that had served him well for so long. Reporters shifted, sensing the moment, the energy shifting again as the tension between them became the axis around which the room now spun. The chairman gestured toward the recorder, his hand trembling ever so slightly. "Ms. Hill, is there something on this device that we should hear?" Anita nodded once. Yes. She reached forward, her fingers pressing the small button on the recorder, the soft click loud in the silence, the machine humming to life as it began to play. The sound that filled the room was not loud. It was quiet. A conversation. A laugh that did not carry joy. Words that twisted through the air, filling the room with the truth that could no longer be denied. Clarence's voice came through the speakers, unmistakable, undeniable. The cadence, the tone, the weight of authority, still present, even as the words betrayed the image he had crafted so carefully. "Come on, Anita. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." A pause. A laugh, cold, empty. "You know how things work around here." The words hung in the air, heavier than the rain, heavier than the marble columns that surrounded them. Anita's face remained calm, her eyes watching Clarence as the recording played, as his own words condemned him in front of the nation, in front of the world. The room was silent, except for the recording, the reporters frozen, pens hovering over notepads, unsure whether to continue writing or to simply listen, to bear witness. Clarence's face was pale now, his hands clenched around the leather binder, knuckles white, the smirk gone, replaced by the raw realization that the walls he had built were crumbling. The recording ended. Silence fell once more, deep, profound, unbreakable. Anita leaned back, turning off the recorder, letting her hands rest on the table as she looked around the room, meeting the eyes of those who could not look away. "Power," she said softly, "does not erase accountability." Outside, thunder rumbled, the rain coming down harder now, the windows streaked with lines of water that blurred the view of the city, turning the world beyond into a painting of gray and silver. Inside, the storm had arrived, and it was not outside the walls. It was here, in this room, in the silence that followed truth, in the eyes of a woman who refused to look away. The chairman cleared his throat again, the sound dry, uncertain. "Ms. Hill, do you wish to submit these recordings as evidence to this committee?" Anita nodded. "Yes." The clerk stepped forward, collecting the recorder, the documents, his hands careful, reverent, understanding that he was holding something that was no longer just paper, no longer just sound. It was now history. Clarence Thomas sat back, his eyes unfocused, staring past Anita, past the committee, past the cameras, seeing something only he could see, the weight of every decision, every word, every moment crashing down upon him. Anita watched him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the calm of someone who had carried the weight of truth alone for too long and had finally set it down. She reached for her water, taking a sip, her hands steady, her breathing calm. And in that moment, the room exhaled, the tension broke. But the truth remained. Outside, the storm continued, the rain washing over the city, the streets glistening under the glow of streetlights as people moved through the world, unaware that history had shifted, that the ground beneath them had moved. Inside, Anita Hill gathered her papers, placing them back into her folder, the weight of them now shared by all who had heard, all who had seen. She stood, the chair sliding back, the sound soft, final. She looked around the room one last time, meeting the eyes of those who had watched, who had listened, who would now carry the truth forward. Clarence Thomas did not look at her. Anita turned and walked toward the door, her steps steady, her head high, the folder clutched in her hand, not as a burden, but as a banner. And as she stepped out into the rain, the storm greeting her like an old friend, she did not flinch. She did not hide. She walked forward, each step a promise that silence would no longer be enough, that truth would no longer be quiet, that the world would no longer turn away. Rain pooled along the curb outside the Supreme Court, a dark ribbon that shimmered beneath the streetlights as the city's morning traffic crawled by, headlights reflecting off wet asphalt like restless fireflies. Inside, the building was quieter now. The storm had moved through the hallways, through the chamber, through the spaces where silence once protected power, and left in its wake a new kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of submission, but the silence that comes after truth has been spoken, when there is nothing left to hide behind, when the air feels sharper, cleaner, colder. Anita Hill walked down the hallway, the echo of her steps soft against the marble floors, her folder held against her chest, the weight of it lighter now, no longer hers alone to carry. Staffers stood to the side, their eyes following her, some with respect, some with uncertainty, all with the understanding that they had witnessed something that would not be forgotten. She passed a window, pausing for a moment to look out at the rain streaking down the glass, the gray sky heavy but alive, the storm outside mirroring the one that had just passed through these halls. In another room, away from the cameras, Clarence Thomas sat alone. The binder lay open in front of him, pages scattered across the table, the words printed there now heavy, undeniable. His fingers drummed softly against the wood, a habit he had picked up in law school, a rhythm that once calmed him, that once reminded him of control. But there was no comfort in it now, no control, only the steady, inescapable beat of consequences arriving, step by step, breath by breath. A staffer knocked once, softly, before entering, a young man with tired eyes, a notepad in hand. "Sir, the committee is ready for you." Clarence looked up, his eyes empty for a moment before the familiar mask slipped back into place, the calm exterior, the carefully measured breath, the silent reminder to himself that he was still who he said he was. He stood, adjusting his robe over his shoulders, smoothing it down with practiced hands. Outside the room, cameras waited. The red lights blinked, the lenses trained on the door, the reporters leaning forward, ready, hungry for the next moment, the next headline, the next clip that would be played over and over, dissected, discussed, debated. Clarence stepped out, the flash of cameras lighting up the hallway, the questions shouted, the microphones pushed forward. He did not answer. He did not look at them. He walked forward, each step measured, each breath counted, the storm behind him, but the weight of it clinging to him with every step. Anita stood at the end of the hallway, her folder now tucked into her bag, her hands free, her eyes on him as he approached. For a moment, their eyes met, a moment that was not captured by the cameras, a moment that belonged only to them, a moment heavy with the unspoken truth that would linger long after the cameras turned away. Clarence looked away first. Anita's phone buzzed in her pocket, the screen lighting up with messages, calls, emails, the world reaching out to her now, voices that had once been silent, now finding the courage to speak. She did not answer, not yet. She stepped outside, the rain falling on her face, cool, sharp, real. She tilted her head back, letting the rain wash over her for a moment, letting it remind her that she was here, that she was alive, that the world was still moving. A black car pulled up to the curb, the driver stepping out to open the door for her. She paused, looking back at the building, at the marble steps, at the columns reaching up into the gray sky. She did not smile, but there was a calm in her eyes, a quiet satisfaction, a promise that the truth had been spoken, and that was enough for now. She got into the car, the door closing softly behind her, the city blurring past the window as the car pulled away from the curb, the rain streaking down the glass like tears that were no longer hers to carry. Inside the building, the committee reconvened. The chairman's gavel struck the wood, the sound sharp, final. Order. Clarence Thomas sat down, his robe settling around him, the cameras capturing every angle, every breath, every flicker in his eyes. He looked calm, but the mask was cracking. Justice Thomas, do you wish to respond? His eyes lifted, meeting the chairman's, the room waiting, the silence heavy. He opened his mouth, the words slow, deliberate. I have nothing further to add at this time. A murmur rippled through the room, reporters scribbling, cameras zooming in, the moment captured, frozen in time. Clarence folded his hands in front of him, his eyes unfocused, seeing beyond the room, beyond the cameras, seeing a future that was now uncertain, a future shaped by words he could no longer deny, by truths he could no longer silence. Outside, Anita's car moved through the city, the rain slowing, the clouds beginning to break apart, thin shafts of sunlight piercing through, lighting up the wet streets, the sidewalks shining like silver rivers winding through the city. She looked out the window, watching as people moved under umbrellas, children splashing in puddles, the world continuing as it always did, unaware that history had shifted, that the world had changed, that power had been challenged, and truth had found its voice. She reached into her bag, pulling out the folder, flipping it open to the first page, her eyes scanning the words she knew by heart, the words that had lived with her, the words that had shaped this day. She closed the folder, holding it against her chest, letting out a breath she had been holding for years. The car turned onto a quiet street, pulling up to a small building, the sign outside reading Community Center. Anita stepped out, the air cool against her skin, the rain now a soft mist in the air. She walked up the steps, pushing open the door, stepping into a room filled with people, their eyes lifting as she entered, their faces lighting up with hope, with gratitude, with understanding. She smiled, a small, quiet smile, the kind that comes when you know you have done what needed to be done, when you have spoken the truth, when you have stood your ground, the kind that says, I am still here. She walked to the front of the room, setting her bag down, looking out at the faces before her, faces of women and men who had their own stories, their own truths, their own battles, faces that now looked to her not as a symbol, but as a proof that silence could be broken, that truth could be spoken, that power could be challenged. She took a deep breath, the room quiet, the air thick with anticipation. She began to speak, and the world listened. Inside the community center, the walls were lined with photographs of families, of community gatherings, of children holding up handmade signs about justice, about hope, about tomorrow. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of rain that clung to people's coats as they settled into chairs, eyes forward, hearts beating in quiet rhythm, waiting. Anita Hill stood at the front, her hands resting lightly on the podium, her fingers tapping once, twice, grounding herself in the soft echo of wood against skin. She looked up, her eyes sweeping across the room, meeting the gaze of each person, pausing, acknowledging them, seeing their stories, seeing their truths. Thank you for being here today, she began, her voice calm, the microphone catching the softness of her tone, amplifying it just enough to fill the room without overpowering it. I know that it is not easy to speak about what needs to be spoken. She paused, letting the words settle, letting the silence hold them in place, letting each person in the room find themselves in the spaces between her sentences. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping softly against the windows, a quiet rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the moment. I know what it feels like to carry something heavy, she continued, her fingers curling lightly around the edge of the podium, to hold it close because the world around you tells you that it is safer to be silent. In the back of the room, a woman in a dark green sweater wiped a tear from her cheek, her hand shaking slightly as she lowered it back into her lap. A man beside her reached over, his hand resting on hers, steadying her, reminding her she was not alone. Anita's eyes softened as she saw them, her voice growing warmer, stronger. "But silence is not peace," she said, her words clear, deliberate. "Silence is not healing. Silence is not justice." A murmur of agreement moved through the room, soft, like a breeze rustling through leaves, carrying with it the collective acknowledgement that silence was a weight they all knew too well. "When I walked into that building this morning," Anita continued, "I was carrying years of silence. I was carrying fear, doubt, uncertainty." Her eyes lifted, steady, unwavering. "But I was also carrying truth." She paused, letting out a breath, her shoulders relaxing as if the act of speaking these words was lifting something from her, something that had clung to her for too long. "And I learned," she said, her voice softening, "that truth is heavier when it is yours alone to carry." She looked around the room, her eyes landing on each face, each story, each silent nod of agreement. "But when we share it," she continued, "when we speak it, when we let it live outside of us, it becomes lighter." A young woman in the front row nodded, her eyes bright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she leaned forward, drinking in every word. Anita smiled, a small, gentle smile, the kind that carried the weight of both pain and resilience. "You deserve to be heard," she said softly. "You deserve to speak your truth." She paused, letting the silence embrace the room, letting the truth of her words settle into the hearts of those who needed them most. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break apart, thin rays of sunlight piercing through, illuminating the wet streets, turning puddles into mirrors that reflected the sky. Inside, the room felt warmer now, the heaviness of silence replaced by the gentle strength of shared truth. Anita stepped back from the podium, taking a seat among the people, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes still forward, still calm, still ready. The woman in the green sweater raised her hand, her voice trembling as she began to speak, her words soft but clear, each sentence a piece of herself that she was finally letting go. Others followed, their voices joining together, weaving a tapestry of stories, of truths, of moments that had once been hidden in the quiet corners of their hearts. And Anita listened. She listened with the patience of someone who knew what it meant to be heard for the first time, what it meant to let go of silence, what it meant to let truth take its place in the world. Meanwhile, across the city, the Supreme Court building stood silent. Inside, Clarence Thomas sat in his chambers, the lights dim, the binder still open in front of him, the pages a reminder of words spoken, of moments that could no longer be hidden. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, the soft rasp of skin against the roughness of the page loud in the quiet room. He closed his eyes, letting out a breath, his mind replaying the recording, the sound of his own voice, the words he had spoken, the laughter that now echoed back to him, hollow, empty. For a moment, his hand trembled. Just for a moment. A knock at the door broke the silence, the sound sharp, pulling him back into the present. "Justice Thomas," a voice called softly from the other side. "They're waiting for you." He opened his eyes, the mask of calm slipping back into place, the practiced neutrality settling over his features like a familiar cloak. He closed the binder, standing, adjusting his robe, smoothing it down with hands that now shook just slightly. He walked out of the room, down the hallway, past the portraits of those who came before him, their painted eyes following him as he moved, silent witnesses to the weight of legacy, of power, of choices made in the quiet corners of history. Outside the building, the rain had stopped. The air was cool, fresh, the world washed clean, the sunlight glinting off the wet marble steps as Clarence Thomas descended them, each step deliberate, each breath measured. Reporters waited, cameras ready, the questions hanging in the air, unasked but loud in their silence. He did not speak. He did not look at them. He stepped into the car, waiting for him, the door closing softly, the world outside blurring as the vehicle pulled away, leaving behind the building, the questions, the truth that now lived within its walls. Across the city, Anita Hill stepped out of the community center, the air cool against her skin, the sunlight warm on her face. She looked up at the sky, the clouds parting, the blue breaking through, a promise of tomorrow. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs, letting the moment settle around her, letting herself feel the quiet that came not from silence, but from peace. She walked down the steps, her bag over her shoulder, the folder inside no longer heavy, no longer a burden, but a reminder of what it meant to speak, to be heard, to let truth live. The city moved around her, alive, restless, unaware of the history that had shifted, of the power that had been challenged, of the truth that had been spoken. But she knew, and that was enough. The city hummed with quiet energy as Anita walked down the sidewalk, the wet pavement reflecting the soft glow of streetlights, the occasional car passing by with a hiss of tires on damp asphalt. She paused at the corner, waiting for the light to change, her reflection looking back at her from the glass of a storefront, the calm in her eyes steady, the weight in her shoulders finally eased. Behind her, the community center remained warm, alive with the echoes of stories shared, the soft murmur of voices finding their strength, the truth no longer hidden in whispers. As she crossed the street, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message, then another, and another. Voices from around the country, from people she had never met, from women and men who had watched, who had listened, who had found in her words the courage to speak their own truths. She stopped for a moment, stepping into the shelter of a small awning as she read the messages. "Thank you. I needed to hear this. You gave me strength. I'm not afraid to speak now." Anita closed her eyes, letting the words sink in, letting them wrap around her like a quiet embrace. For so long, she had carried the fear of speaking, the fear of being alone, the fear of being silenced. Now, those fears were being replaced by something else, by connection, by solidarity, by hope. Across the city, Clarence Thomas sat in a conference room, the lights dimmed, the windows looking out over the city, the glow of the streetlights below casting long shadows across the walls. A television was on in the corner, the volume low, but the images unmistakable. His face, her face, the words spoken, the headlines scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Clarence Thomas faces public reckoning. Anita Hill's testimony sparks national conversation. Calls for accountability grow. He turned away from the screen, his jaw tightening, his hands clasped together, his fingers tapping against each other in a restless rhythm. For years, he had moved through the world with the certainty that came with power, with position, with the silence that surrounded him like armor. Now, that silence was broken. He stood, walking to the window, looking out at the city, the lights stretching out into the distance, the world moving on even as his own seemed to pause. He closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath, the weight of every decision, every word, every silence pressing down on him. Down below, the streets were alive with people, moving through the city, their lives unfolding in small, quiet moments. A mother holding her child's hand as they crossed the street, a couple laughing as they shared an umbrella, a man closing his shop for the night, pulling down the metal shutter with a soft clang. Life moved on. But, for Clarence, the weight of the moment held him still. At that same moment, Anita stepped into a small coffee shop, the bell above the door jingling softly as she entered. The warmth of the space enveloped her, the rich scent of coffee and pastries filling the air, the quiet murmur of conversations creating a soft background hum. She ordered a tea, her voice calm, steady, the barista offering her a small smile as she handed over the cup. Anita found a seat by the window, wrapping her hands around the warmth of the cup, watching the steam curl into the air, disappearing into the soft glow of the lights above. She let herself breathe, deeply, fully, allowing the moment to settle into her bones, the quiet peace of having spoken the truth, wrapping around her like a blanket. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small notebook, flipping it open to a blank page. For a moment, she simply sat, the pen resting in her hand, the tip hovering over the paper. Then, slowly, she began to write. Not the details of the testimony she had given, not the words that had already been spoken, but the feelings, the fear, the courage, the quiet determination that had carried her through the moments when her voice trembled, when her hands shook, when her heart pounded so loudly she thought the world could hear it. She wrote about the women who had come before her, who had spoken, who had been silenced, who had paved the path she now walked. She wrote about the women who would come after, who would find in her story the courage to tell their own. She wrote about the hope that had carried her, the hope that still burned quietly within her, even as the world felt heavy. Across the city, Clarence Thomas sat back down, his mind replaying the recording, the sound of his own voice, the laughter that now felt hollow, the words that could not be taken back. He thought of the years he had spent building his reputation, his career, the walls he had constructed to keep the world at bay. He thought of the moments when he had chosen silence, when he had let power speak for him, when he had believed that silence was strength. And he realized that silence was not strength. Silence was fear. In the coffee shop, Anita closed her notebook, taking a sip of her tea, letting the warmth fill her, letting the quiet of the moment settle around her. She looked out the window, watching the people pass by, the city alive with movement, with stories, with truths waiting to be spoken. She smiled softly, the kind of smile that comes not from happiness, but from peace, from the quiet certainty that comes when you have done what you needed to do, when you have spoken, when you have been heard. Outside, the clouds continued to break apart, the stars beginning to peek through the thinning veil of gray, the night sky returning, clear and cold, a promise of a new day to come. Anita stood, leaving the coffee shop, the bell jingling softly as she stepped back into the night, the air cool against her skin, the world open before her. She walked down the street, each step measured, each breath calm, the city alive around her, the future unfolding with every step. And as she walked, she knew that the truth had been spoken, that the silence had been broken, that the world would never be the same. And that was enough. The dawn came quietly, a thin line of pale light on the horizon, brushing the tops of buildings with soft gold as the city stretched awake beneath the crisp morning air. The storm had passed, leaving behind streets washed clean, the sidewalks glistening under the first rays of sunlight, the world reborn in the hush that follows rain. Anita Hill sat by her window, a cup of tea steaming gently in her hands, the warmth seeping into her skin as she watched the sunrise paint the sky in gentle hues of peach and rose. She breathed in deeply, letting the cool air fill her lungs, letting the calm of the morning wrap around her like a soft shawl. For the first time in years, the weight in her chest felt lighter, not gone, but lighter. She thought of the day before, of the committee room, of the cameras, of the faces watching her as she spoke. She thought of the way her voice had carried, clear and steady, even as her heart thundered beneath her ribs, even as the weight of years of silence pressed against her. She thought of Clarence Thomas, sitting across from her, his eyes fixed on her, the mask slipping for just a moment as her words reached him, as the truth settled between them like a living, breathing thing. She sipped her tea, closing her eyes, letting the warmth settle into her, letting the peace of the moment fill the spaces left empty by fear. Across the city, Clarence Thomas stood by his own window, looking out at the sunrise, the light catching in his tired eyes, painting lines of gold across the shadows of the room behind him. His robe hung on the back of a chair, the fabric heavy, the weight of it a reminder of the power he held, the power that now felt like a burden rather than a shield. He rubbed a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. The words of the recording played in his mind, his own voice echoing back to him, the laughter that now sounded harsh, foreign, like the voice of a man he barely recognized. "You know how things work around here." He closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavier than the robe he would soon put on, heavier than the silence he had once relied upon. The world outside moved on, cars passing by, people heading to work, the city alive with the rhythms of another day. But inside, time felt different. each second heavy with the memory of what had been spoken, of what could not be taken back, of what would live on beyond him. Anita dressed simply, a soft blue blouse, dark slacks, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes clear as she looked at herself in the mirror. She did not see weakness. She did not see fear. She saw a woman who had stood in front of power and had spoken, who had refused to let silence be her story, who had chosen truth no matter the cost. She picked up her bag, slipping the folder inside, the papers now neatly stacked, no longer the burden they once were, but a record, a testament, a promise to herself that she would never be silent again. She stepped out into the morning, the air crisp, the sky bright, the world alive around her as she walked down the steps of her building, each step steady, each breath calm. As she walked, people recognized her. A woman walking her dog paused, her eyes meeting Anita's, a soft nod of acknowledgement passing between them. A man jogging past slowed, lifting a hand in a quiet wave, respect in his eyes. A young woman on a bicycle stopped at the light, pulling out one earbud, her eyes bright as she mouthed, "Thank you." Anita smiled softly, her heart warm, the connection small but powerful, the threads of solidarity weaving around her as she continued down the sidewalk. At the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas dressed in silence, the robe settling over his shoulders, the fabric brushing against him like a reminder, the weight of it heavy as he fastened the clasps, smoothing it down with careful hands. He looked at himself in the mirror, seeing the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the man he had become. He saw the mask he wore, the calm he projected, the power he embodied. And for a moment, he saw the cracks, the places where the truth had seeped in, where the silence had broken, where the certainty had faltered. He turned away from the mirror, stepping out into the hallway, the sound of his footsteps soft against the polished floors, the portraits of past justices watching him as he walked, their painted eyes filled with the silent witness of history. Outside, reporters waited, cameras ready, the red lights blinking as they prepared to capture every moment, every expression, every movement. Clarence paused at the top of the steps, looking out over the crowd, the city spread out before him, the morning light catching in the lenses of the cameras, the silence heavy, expectant. He took a breath, letting it out slowly, his hands folding in front of him, the mask slipping back into place, the calm returning, the power settling around him once more. He stepped forward, descending the steps, each step measured, each movement deliberate, the world watching, the cameras capturing, the moment immortalized. But inside, he knew that the world had changed. That silence was no longer his shield. That power was no longer unquestioned. That truth had been spoken, and that it would live on, long after the cameras turned away, long after the headlines changed, long after the world moved on. Across the city, Anita Hill sat on a bench in a small park, the sunlight warming her skin, the breeze playing with the edges of her hair, the sounds of the city soft around her. She closed her eyes, tilting her face up to the sun, letting the warmth sink into her, letting the peace of the moment fill her. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing out, clear and bright, a reminder of the world that would continue, of the future that was still being written, of the hope that lived in the spaces between breaths. Anita opened her eyes, watching them, a soft smile on her lips, her heart steady, her spirit calm. She reached into her bag, pulling out her notebook, flipping it open to a fresh page. She began to write. Not about the past, not about the fear, not about the silence, but about the future, about hope, about strength, about the power of truth, spoken boldly, shared bravely, lived fully. And as she wrote, the world continued around her. The sun rose higher, the city moved, life unfolded, and the truth lived on. And if you've made it here, still listening, still breathing in the weight and calm of this moment, know that stories like this, stories that matter, stories that challenge power and honor truth deserve to live. And if you want to keep walking through these stories with us, if you want to keep seeing the world through the quiet lens of truth, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, so you don't miss the next moment that might change the way you see the world. And if this story moved you, share it. Because every time truth is shared, every time it is heard, it grows stronger. Thank you for being here, for listening, for letting truth breathe. We'll see you in the next one.